May I please call Miss Vicky Ford?
If you stand, and if you take the Bible in your right hand, please. And if you repeat after me, I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Sorry to keep you waiting, Miss Ford.
Thank you.
Miss Ford, can I ask you to give your...
Mrs. Ford. Thank you,
Mrs.
sorry.
Ford, can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry?
Victoria Grace Ford.
Mrs. Ford, you ought to have a statement in front of you that bears the number INQ 000 587 997. Have you got that in front of you?
Sorry.
So you ought to have a witness statement in front of you.
My witness statement?
Yes.
Yeah, I've got that.
Right.
Thank you.
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge?
It is. I would, though, say it's not the best bit of work I've ever done. I was recovering from cancer treatment at the time I completed this. So on rereading it, it's all true, but there's some things I might have wanted to caveat on nuance a bit more. So maybe if we get into that, we'll do that.
Certainly. Well, thank you for taking the time to do it when you're obviously going through a rough phase. So.
Thank you.
Ms. Ford, I hope I can start with some things that are not controversial and easy. I think it's right that you served as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Department of Education from February 2020 to September 2021. Is
Yes.
that right? And that was your first ministerial post,
Yes.
I think. And specifically, you were appointed on the 17th of February
Yes.
of that year. And you were the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Children and Families,
Yes.
correct? And your responsibilities included, there's quite a long list,
Yeah.
so I'm not going to say everything, but just to cover some of the things that might be of most interest to us. You had responsibility for children's social care, encompassing oversight of the system,
Yeah.
funding and workforce, and that included child protection and children in care
Yes.
too. Is that correct? You also had responsibility for special educational needs as
Yeah.
well, including the funding of that sector. You had responsibility for early years provision, and that included early years education as
Yeah.
well, I understand. You had responsibility for alternative provision as well. You had a responsibility for disadvantage and social mobility. Also for school food,
Yeah.
including free school meals.
Yep.
And then a broader responsibility, I think, for the mental health of children and young people as well. Is that right?
In schools.
In schools. Okay, so that's probably quite an important delineation. You had a responsibility, but there was also responsibility in the Department of Health
Yes.
for the mental health of children
Yes.
as well, correct? And I think that within the scope of the mental health of children and young people, you also had a responsibility for online safety as well. Is that right?
Especially where it touched education.
Okay.
The primary responsibility was within DCMS and also owned by the Home Office to a certain extent.
And you also had responsibility for policies to protect against serious violence as well. Is that right?
Again, often working with the Home Office on those issues.
And I think we'll come back to that and work
Yeah.
with the Home Office as well. Now, you're
If I
described...
can say, it was responsibility for England.
Yes, of course.
And obviously, I reported to the Secretary of State for Education, who had the overall responsibility for the department.
Yes. So you are someone who sits within government, described as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Children. But did you have overarching responsibility for children within government?
So, just like one minister won't have responsibility for all adults, you know, and I guess it's the key question we'll come back to as an exam question is, should you have a Secretary of State for children? I would argue that that is the Education Minister, is the overall responsibility for children. But obviously, children are touched not just by education and what happens in schools, not just by children's social services, but they use the NHS, they use transport, they use these other areas as well. So often you're needing to work with other ministers who also will have responsibility for children where they touch their departments. You do have a convening power, which is important. People listen to you because they know you will be talking to them specifically about children, so you're respected across government in that way.
I think what the inquiry might be specifically interested in is this issue of who looks at the child overall and who looks at the cumulative impacts of decisions that are made about children. So, for example, in a pandemic, the decision to lock down, the decisions made about children's ability to play or exercise, children's health. Those are not things that necessarily fall within the Department for Education.
They're not, and where an issue in another government department is having a very serious impact on children, you will raise that even though that's not your lead responsibility. So, for example, I would say online safety. Okay, not my lead responsibility as Children's Minister, but one that was clearly impacting children and one where clearly I could be convening the meetings and be spoken to for the specialist knowledge of the impact of children. But you can't I don't think you could say, take every bit of the health service where it touches a child away from the Department for Health and say that now needs to sit within a department just for children. I don't think that would work either. But there were lots of times when I attended cross-government meetings of ministers in order to raise issues pertaining to children and to be there, and serious secretaries of state were listening and taking that on board.
All right. I think we're probably at a...
moving on a bit more, but yeah.
Yes, I think that we might have jumped a hurdle.
Yeah.
I think what we're just interested in at the moment is understanding whether there was a part of government during the pandemic that had oversight of the whole child. So the part of government that could say, we've had lockdowns, children's ability to play is constrained, we can see impacts on mental health. In other words, bring the holistic picture.
I would say that a lot of that came to me, but I would also say there wasn't a government department other than number 10 in the Cabinet Office who would have that holistic approach to an adult.
Yes.
Okay, and you've got to have all members of government interested in all members of the population. Okay, so everything eventually goes through number 10 or through the Cabinet Office as well to bring it all together, and that is important. You couldn't just say every decision has to come to one minister just because it's a child as opposed to just because it's an adult, if that makes sense. Okay.
Did you consider during the pandemic that worked sufficiently well? In other words, I think you're suggesting that you were the person who had that
I think that
oversight of
where there were things happening in other government departments that were impacting on children, I had the opportunity to raise them. So, for example, I attended quite a lot of the COVID-0 meetings,
yes,
which were the operational meetings, often at cabinet level, but often the Secretary of State would delegate to me, and that would be a time when I could raise, we're worried about this impact on children or that impact on children, and was always listened to.
And do you think then that worked sufficiently well during the pandemic? In other words,
I think when you look back on the decisions in the pandemic, not everything worked perfectly well. Okay, it was a really, really challenging time. It was very challenging for a lot of people, and it was challenging for people of all ages. It was particularly challenging for certain children and their families more than other types of children for their families, but it was also very challenging for some very much older people.
Yes.
So I don't think anybody who was involved at the time can say everything worked perfectly well.
Yes.
But that ability to shout out, maybe we missed some things, but on the whole, if things were being brought to us as this is an issue, this is an impact, this needs changes, and there was lots of listening to things from the bottom up, you had that voice and people listened to you, even though you're the parliamentary undersecretary, new minister, etc. You're still being listened to because people do care about children. They did care about children.
All right. Well, we'll come and look at some of the decisions that needed to be made and policy approaches in due course, just focusing at the minute on how central government worked. Some witnesses have suggested that decision-making about education, which obviously really also is decision-making about children, was too located in Downing Street and not sufficiently located enough in the Department for Education. Does that reflect your experience?
Was it Downing Street or was it the Department for Health?
Sorry.
So there were definitely some things that I would have wanted to do and that I would recommend to my future self, if you ever had to live through this again, that public health would not have let us do because of the risk of spreading COVID more.
All right.
And we can talk about that. I was not responsible for decisions about closing schools, reopening schools, etc. And those were obviously some of the very high-profile discussions. But I know you're talking to the Secretary of State, so you can talk to him about that.
All right. I'm just going to ask you a little bit more, if I may, about that, because when I asked the question, you said Downing Street at the Department of Health. I think the real issue was the decision not sufficiently proximate to the Department for Education as a starting point. In other words, were these decisions being taken by parts of government that didn't have the insight and the expertise?
No, I wouldn't say that. Okay, so the really, really big ask that we had right at the beginning, when that decision was to close schools, but to keep them open for vulnerable children, the possibility for vulnerable children to go to schools. That was a really big ask. Nobody had done that before, as far as I've been aware from other countries. And it was something that Downing Street did. So they were listening to the big asks.
All right. We'll look at that.
But they obviously had to balance decisions about control of the pandemic, etc.
Yes.
But yes, you did need to go and get things cleared. And there was a three-way clearing of processes through Department for Health, DFE, and Number 10.
And did that impede decision-making as far as you were concerned, or was that just a necessary part of the process?
So I was wanting to say this later, but so, for example, when it came to after the first lockdown, schools being locked down, I was very keen to push that all kids would have had the chance to be seen by their teachers at least once before the summer holidays, okay, from a mental health sort of check-in point of view. But in terms of the public health desire to not unlock schools too quickly because of the impact on transmission, that was something we couldn't get through. Okay? I still think it's something we should have done, but it was and could have helped a lot of children. But it was the public health, and I know that the Secretary of State, who would primarily have had those really big discussions about school on lockdown and not lockdown, was constantly on the push for how much can I get reopening of schools through from a public health point of view.
Okay, I'm going to move on, if I may, to the outset of the pandemic, and bearing in mind that you took up your role on the 17th of February. When you did, were you made familiar with the reasonable worst-case scenario planning that had been commissioned on behalf of the department by Mr. Rahman, who was then the Chief Scientific Advisor?
So I wasn't the lead minister on pre-pandemic planning. That was both the schools minister and the Secretary of State were involved in that. I'm sure in my briefing pack, because I remember the weekend before I first walked into the department, spending a huge amount of time reading a lot of briefing. I'm sure there would have been some briefing on it. I'd received briefings on COVID from Chris Whitty, had been briefing MPs in Parliament beforehand. So I knew there was planning going on. And I started receiving briefings on COVID planning within weeks. I mean, admittedly, it was a sort of 4-week period between becoming the minister and it really accelerating it.
I wonder if we can just have a look at the reasonable worst-case scenarios. INQ 000542908. So we can see this is the sort of, at that time, the worst-case scenario figures that existed. I don't think we need to look at those, but for example, they set out things like the percentage of the workforce that might be off work at any time, correct? Are you familiar with that?
I'm not sure I saw exactly this document. I do recall discussing things like staff sickness planning.
Yes.
I recall going to visit my own local authorities, Children's Social Services team, and asking them what do they think we should need to be planning for, and them giving me feedback. This was early March on needing to be able to approve new foster carers quickly from the ground up level. So there was already discussions happening with local authorities, with the department, what sort of things do we need to be prepared for.
If we could just look, please, at page 3 of this. Thank you. So there are a number of scenarios. I think you've been provided with this that were directly relevant, I think, to children's social care. So I think on page 3, if we look at box 4, for example, that illness would lead to a lack of social workers. If we go down a few boxes, please, that residential, that's the 122, residential care homes would require isolation. Below that, foster carers weren't able to take children in placements. Below that, if schools were closed for a significant period of time. I think if we go over the
And
page,
I recall
please.
feeding into this as well. I've mentioned Essex fed in some scenario planning that they were concerned about recruitment of foster carers. I don't know if it was as early as the date on this, but in early March, I've looked through notes since writing my testimony. I'd fed in about concerns about children with SEND, keeping special schools open. Those concerns had come from MPs, for example. What are we going to do if that happens? So feeding things in to the central planning of different scenarios is important.
Yes, I'm just going to stay with this. So I think the next one down, children may be unwilling to allow social workers into their homes. Yes. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's a number of pages. And I think if we get to page 7, how do we educate children who aren't in school for a long time? So these were factual scenarios, weren't they, that were being posited from the 6th of February. So this isn't a plan, is it? This is a long list of things that the department might need to confront in due course,
Well,
correct?
If the question is, should there have been more planning pre-pandemic, then the answer is obviously yes. But was this scenario planning going on and important? Yes.
So I'm going to come to what this prompted, but I think the first question is this very long list of factual scenarios.
Yeah.
When did that, in fact, prompt a plan or a document that responded to each of them?
So I had been being sent some COVID planning in early March, at various meetings with discussions. I think it's fair to say that we were making plans assuming, hang on, how do I step back again? The big concern was vulnerable children was, are you going to be able to keep eyes on vulnerable children? Because it's so important to have eyes on for safeguarding, okay? And right up till the March 16th date, we had assumed that schools were going to carry on being able to stay open until Easter and then have Easter as a sort of fire break. And what changed dramatically was the March the 16th, the new analysis that happened with new numbers being crunched that showed a much higher level of death, a much higher level of spread, that COVID was spreading much more quickly than anybody had predicted beforehand.
All right.
And that accelerated that suddenly we are going to need to go into closing schools now and making those decisions much more quickly than had been thought beforehand.
The factual scenarios, the reasonable worst case scenarios, they weren't predicated on schools closing. I think those were a number of general scenarios.
They were general scenarios, but it was sort of linked. You know, that how bad's it going to be suddenly got a lot worse and a lot faster.
And so in terms of if we're separating out school closures from plans for vulnerable children and keeping eyes on vulnerable children, when did the plans for keeping eyes on vulnerable children materialise?
So I think I had been sent documents back in, sorry, bear with me. I'd had a briefing on the 4th of March. I'd received a rolling brief on the 14th of February. There'd been a submission received on the 27th of February. On the 6th of March, I had a meeting with my local authority to understand best how a well-performing local authority was thinking about that, as well as other things. I had another meeting, discuss the rolling brief on the 11th of March. There were discussions in that rolling brief, with discussions of feedback they'd had from the Association of Directors of Children's Services, with the issues that were coming from them. So these were all happening, this bottom-up feedback into that type spreadsheet.
All right, but not a plan.
No, as I said, should there have been a better plan? Yes. Was I responsible for COVID planning within the department? No.
Well, I think I'm just trying to understand or explore at the minute how it is that the person who has responsibility for children and responsibility for responding to the
So
scenarios.
I was feeding into submissions, but I was not. There were 2 out of the 5 ministers in the actual meetings on COVID at that time.
Right.
Okay.
And I wonder if we can just bring up the statement, please, of Miss Oram.
And those, including in those meetings, the lead minister who'd been in the department for many, many years. the schools minister at that time.
Oh, do you
Okay.
mean Sir
Minister
Nick Gibb?
Sir Nick Gibb.
So
Okay, so
can-
he was the lead minister feeding in on these issues. I was feeding in questions and scenarios we needed to plan for. And when I say as well as the scenarios, there were also different actions that we wanted taking.
So let me try and understand. When were you feeding to Sir Nick Gibb the planning, the eventualities that needed to be planned for?
So-
Was this in March?
So for example, I was receiving briefings. I was having discussions with my team. They were briefing me on how their discussions were happening vis-a-vis COVID. I was raising points about them. I fed into my private office, who then fed into the central planning on COVID, the feedback I had received from my own local authority, i.e. we need to be able to approve foster care placements more quickly, and because we were really concerned that more children were going to need foster carers. We were really concerned because many foster carers are elderly and therefore may not be that would have been clinically vulnerable themselves. So I'd fed that in on early March. I'd been feeding in comments I'd had from previous children's ministers on children with children with disabilities, feeding that into central planning earlier on, even though I was not the lead minister.
Right. So, sorry, is this in March? This
Early
was
March.
happening. Okay. Can we just go, please, to Miss Orham's statement? This is INQ 000587996. Thank you. And if we just go to page 5, and the bottom of that, paragraph 2.2. And this is picking up the chronology in March.
Yeah.
I won't read all of this out, Miss Ford,
Yeah.
and I think you've been provided this. She says, this paired with reasonable worst-case scenario information received from the scientific, from SAGE, on the 26th of February, and the knowing existing pressures in the children's social care system led to the identification of these 3 interrelated challenges. And then she exhibits 2 documents. I think you've been provided with those documents, haven't you? And I think one of them is, it's just the SAGE reasonable worst case scenario document, isn't it? It's not a Department for Education document. Are you familiar with that? I think you
don't
can,
know.
if you will take it from me, that that's what one of them is. And the document ending 717 is a witness statement from June 2020 in the proceedings that were brought in respect of the adoption and coronavirus regulations. Yes? I think you've been provided with that.
I'm really sorry. I don't know which document the 26717.
So the document ending 896, if you can take it from me, that's the SAGE reasonable worst case scenario document.
From February.
Yes, I think it's from February.
Would have. My understanding is that the SAGE reasonable worst case that they were thinking in February was actually not as bad as it appeared on the 16th of March modelling.
Yes, I think at the minute I'm just identifying that these are not, the documents being referred to are not contemporaneous plans or documents that identify these challenges, because I think the second document is a witness statement. In fact, you can take it from me, it is a witness statement in the judicial review proceedings that were brought about the adoption and coronavirus regulations. So just in terms of coming back to planning, as I understand it, these were the really significant challenges that had been identified within the department. Is that correct?
And I think that absolutely fair. Okay? You're potentially going to have far fewer opportunities to have eyes on children.
Yes.
You're going to have workforce pressures, and children's social services were already under a lot of pressure. It was different in different parts of the country. in different local authorities. And then there was, in the beginning, a real concern that we were going to see more children whose parents had died or were seriously unwell, so that we were going to see more children who were going to need care. And those are really, really difficult things to manage.
Yeah. So these were so can we take it then? These were the three significant planning assumptions.
Yeah.
But not as it were, I don't think, but please tell me if I'm wrong, reflected in a planning document that we can identify
I think you will find in all of these what types of things are we going to do to try and mitigate against these risks. Okay, there was a huge amount of work going on in different areas to try and mitigate against each of these different risks. You're never going to be able to put a full sticking plaster over all of these risks and say they don't exist. But boy, were we planning for different things to mitigate these.
Okay. That's what I want to ask you about and examine, because I think if we go on to read the next paragraph in Miss Orme's statement, she sets out, as DFE identified these key challenges, officials began planning and acting to prioritise support for children in the frontline workforce. And I think what I'm just trying to identify is the point at which that planning began, and when, for example, the planning began in order to consider the position of vulnerable children in a way that reflected the factual scenarios that had been set out in mid-February.
So, and I can't remember. Okay? I can't remember when I was first briefed that we were going to, for example, reopen the social workers register to allow people who had previously been qualified as social workers to come back to work, which was one of the workforce mitigations.
Yes.
Okay. I can't remember the exact date at which that was first brought in place. I can remember that when we suddenly had to accelerate the closure of schools, that we were pushing for vulnerable children to be on the list of people that should be kept open for schools. Okay? Yeah. I can remember that we didn't know we'd got it agreed until right at the very last minute.
All right.
Okay.
So when did the planning, let's make it more specific then, in terms of the planning for the position of vulnerable children in the eventuality that schools would close, when did the planning for that eventuality start?
So the decision that schools would close happened between the 16th and 17th of March on the back of that information. The decision to push that they should keep staying open for vulnerable children happened as soon as it became clear that schools were going to have to close much sooner than needed, and getting the green light to keep them open for vulnerable children was literally in that time frame between then and the announcement.
So I think is the really short answer to that planning was pretty much contemporaneous with the decision to close schools.
To close schools, yes. But I'm sure that we were trying to answer questions that no one had ever thought the question existed before, let alone what could the answer be. No one had thought about what if we have to close schools. And so once it became we need to close schools, it was, but we need to make sure that we keep them for vulnerable children.
So are you saying no one had thought
I can't say that or not say that. I'm saying as soon as the question was asked, who do you need to keep schools open for, we said key workers and vulnerable children.
But are you, sorry, I just want to be clear about this, are you saying...
I had not been in the pre-planning meetings. So I don't know whether Sir Nick had been saying keep them open for vulnerable children since January, February, okay? Because I had not been in those meetings.
Had
I
you,
know that as soon as it was, we're going to need to close them, we were saying they need to stay open for vulnerable children.
Had you confronted the question or the possibility that schools might have to close before the 16th or 17th of March?
I had been told by the Secretary of State and the schools minister that they were anticipating we would keep schools open until Easter.
Well, that only takes you to Easter.
I understand
That's-
that, and that would be a fire break during which time you would have this preparation. Okay? It was all happening much faster.
Yeah. So I think we take it from that then that it was at the last minute for you also.
Yes, but I was not the minister responsible. I was feeding in the ground level feedback of the things we needed to plan for. The closing of schools happened in a huge rush.
Yeah, okay. I think that is probably what your witness statement reflects, but I
Yes.
had just wanted to check this
Yeah.
to make sure that that the inquiry hadn't missed anything, because you say at paragraph 4.3, I did not attend any ministerial meetings that considered the possible closure of schools
No.
between the 14th of February and the 16th of March, correct?
No, I mean, I would not have attended the ministerial meetings, okay, that were considering those topics.
But-
We used to have quite high-level meetings between ministers on everything going on in the department, but I wouldn't have considered, at which I do recollect at one point the Secretary of State saying, we still think that COVID will be at Easter, and that was in the weeks before that we'll get through to Easter.
Okay. I mean,
That's
one,
my recollection.
yes. But I mean, in terms of how things worked in the Department for
Yeah.
Education, you have a Secretary of State, you have a fellow minister.
Yeah.
This is one understands a situation, but is there not day-to-day contact and discussions between you and trying to
Not necessarily every
think
day.
about what would
okay?
happen? What are we
You'll be feeding
confronting?
it, because not necessarily every day. You might be out on visits. You're probably back to back with lots of other issues. I was trying to set up a full review of the SEND system. We were launching the full review of the children's social care system. We would have been absolutely back to back. You would have had a ministerial meeting once a week. We did have more joint ministerial meetings in that crunch week of the 16th of March. I remember Gavin coming back from the cabinet meeting at which these new numbers had been presented in a very shocked state.
And you hadn't been made or provided with advice about what SAGE was saying from the start of February onwards in terms of the possibility that mass school closures might at some point be needed?
I knew that we were discussing mass school closures, but not that they were happening in that time frame, if that makes sense. School closures were not being envisaged in that time frame, and the plan was to get to Easter before you could then think about. I don't know if they were discussing every school being closed, not every school being closed, because I was not part of that. Okay, I know I'd received a briefing from the 11th of March. It's particularly in advance of coming here today. I've asked them the team at DFE to go back through all the briefings that I had prior to the 16th of March. I was not the lead minister on planning for COVID.
I'm going to
Okay?
turn to ask you about planning for vulnerable children and the children who fell within your areas of responsibility. You've, I think, explained in your witness statement that, and I think this is at 3.1, Mrs. Ford, at the point at which I became aware on the 17th of March that it was likely that schools would need to restrict attendance. As I understand it, it was at that point
Yes.
that the officials within your department started to work up policy
Yeah.
on which children would fall within the vulnerable children category. Is that correct?
Yes.
So can you help with why that hadn't been done beforehand and why, as part of general planning, in the context of a pandemic, let's put school closures to one side.
So schools had, schools had never closed like this beforehand, okay? And the speed at which COVID was suddenly coming towards us, I don't know if you remember how suddenly it was sort of like you knew there was danger around the corner, okay? I had been going to briefings. I was one of very few MPs who'd been turning up to Chris Whitty briefings. I remember the first time I turned up, there was 5 MPs from 750 had gone to a meeting on this weird disease. That was early January. So I'd been aware that this thing was coming, okay? We had been aware it was coming. And then suddenly what it showed from the March the 16th change, that analysis, I think it was the 16th or 17th, we were suddenly given a complete change of data and numbers that showed over 1 million people likely, not worst case scenario, but likely to die if things didn't happen very quickly. And they were, my understanding, completely different to the numbers that had been being shared previously. Okay? I don't think I'd seen SAGE analysis before that. I don't recollect that. But suddenly, these new numbers were very, very different. And as a result, a much deeper lockdown was suddenly, we've got to go.
All right, so do we take from that it wasn't until the 16th of March that it crystallised or that the penny dropped that there needed to be planning for vulnerable children in the
I
context
think
of a pandemic?
a penny dropped probably is a... I think that's actually... I don't want to use crass, but I think it was much more serious than a penny dropped.
Well,
Okay,
crystallised.
sorry.
No, that's fine.
It was incredibly serious.
Yeah.
It was suddenly, this disease, which was unknown beforehand, was spreading much more quickly, transmitting much more quickly than people had thought, and the potential death rate potentially much higher than people had thought. Okay? So, yeah.
So to go back to my question, it crystallised then, the threat crystallised on the 16th of March,
The threat changed,
right?
okay? The threat changed. Because I'm a mathematician, okay? So that forecasts and numbers were completely different to what had been seen before.
All right. So just to go back to my question and to pin this down, was it the 16th of March and that change that prompted for the first time distinct consideration being given to planning for vulnerable children?
As I said, no, there had been planning for vulnerable children. Okay, I had fed into that the week beforehand. We need to get guidance on children with severe disabilities. I'd fed into that on the 8th of March, so 10 days beforehand, we need to put more thought on how to fast-track more foster carers. So there were planning going on. The actual decision to close schools, and then what are we going to do about who can come to school, that was... I think things were also moving because depending on how serious the threat was, and the threat, as I said, just changed, depending on how hard public health were going to want to lock down society, and therefore how deep they were going to want to do the lockdown of schools.
All right. So I think then it comes to planning for vulnerable children and what would happen to them if they weren't at school. That started on the 16th of March.
No.
No? Okay.
No. As I said, there were plans happening of different bits, but what are we going to need to do? The actual who should be allowed into school and not allowed into school happened on the 16th of March.
All right. And was there a definition of who vulnerable children, who would fall within that category prior to the 16th of March?
No.
I just want to go back to your witness statement and just what you said happened on the 16th of March. I think you said out there that on the 16th of March, you met with directors and deputy directors responsible for children's social care, SEND, early years and free school meals to understand how COVID-19 would impact on these areas. So was that the first time there had been that sort of meeting?
I think it's the first time I brought them all together.
Right. And I think...
But I'd had discussions with them individually differently.
And then moving on, I think on the 18th of March, you've said out in your witness statement, sorry, this is at paragraph 4.9, that you met with the director and president of the Association of Directors of Children's Services. Mm-hmm. So that was on the day that school closures were announced.
And I'd also met with her on the 13th of March, a week beforehand.
And when you met with her on the 13th of March, had the prospect that schools might close form part of the discussions?
No, because it wasn't under discussion.
Right. So that meeting...
It was pre that.
Yes.
I mean, I know it probably sounds completely bonkers that on the 13th of March you wouldn't have known what was coming, but it was such a big change in the numbers, such a big change in the spreads.
All right, I'm going to move on then to some of the policy that was promulgated in response to the decision to close schools. And I think it obviously follows from everything that you've said, Mrs. Ford, that none of that policy existed prior to the 18th of March. It was all formulated thereafter, correct?
Well, no, because I don't know how much work Nick was doing on vulnerable children as regards to school opening, school closing. Okay? So I don't know that. Okay? I don't know whether or not because he was the minister responsible for schools. Okay? What I do know is that there were discussions on how many children can we still have safely in schools.
All right. So if we just go to the first iteration of the policy then, this is at INQ 000 541144.
Can you put that up?
I think it's coming up.
Is this the...
We can go to the 22nd of March, if that's...
Is this the 19th of March guidance?
Yes, we have some guidance on the 19th of March.
So the 19th of March guidance came out really quickly.
Yes.
And this was primarily to get the list of who was an essential worker out into the public domain.
Right. And
Okay. There was a huge demand from parents to know whether or not they were going to be on the list of essential workers, or did they need to plan for their other childcare and to be able to work from home, for example. So that came out really, really quickly. 2 quite short pages on schools, but the rest of it was really the list on critical workers.
Okay. If we could just go to page 3 of this, please.
And that was followed a few days later with slightly more on what was a vulnerable child.
Yes, and I think the point is that this was issued on the 19th of March as an immediate response to the announcement. And we can see here that it sets out, and this is just from and the most recent scientific advice. And we can, so this is providing guidance, isn't it, as to which children would be entitled to go to school.
Yeah.
Yes. So we can see the message in the paragraph below. That's why government has asked parents to keep their children at home wherever possible, and asked schools to remain open only for those children who absolutely need to attend. And we can, if we go down.
And as I said, this was in the background when every MP's inbox was exploding with parents saying, I do this, am I a critical worker, can I have a place, can I have a place, can I have a place?
Yes, I just want...
So this was to clarify the point of this guidance on the 19th was mostly what was the list of critical workers on the back.
Yes, but it was also to provide guidance, wasn't it, to schools about
to a certain extent,
children.
But I think it was 4 days later, the much more detailed guidance on vulnerable children came out.
But we can see the embryo of it here.
Yeah, exactly.
That schools and all childcare providers asked to provide care for a limited number of children who
And
are
I
vulnerable.
think if you scroll down a bit, there's this important bit about we know that schools will also want to support other children.
And it doesn't provide any detail about who those children might be, and presumably that's because there hadn't been time to work up a policy as to that.
No. There was a very, very strong belief in the department that schools know their children best.
Yes.
That no matter how much we in the department tried to put children in boxes, there would be children who didn't fit in those boxes, and that schools would need flexibility to identify what we call the other vulnerable children. And we needed to give that, to empower schools to be able to say, even though that child's not in your categorisation, that child is other vulnerable and needs to come in.
Yes.
Okay? Otherwise, we would miss some children.
Yes, I think we can pick that up at page 1 of this guidance. So what is the definition of vulnerable children? And it sets out that it's those who have a social worker and those up to the age of 25 who have EHC plans, correct?
And other vulnerable children.
And the other vulnerable children, absolutely. And we get that from over the page, don't we? We know that, if we look please at page 2.
This is on the next set of guidance,
we know that schools and
22nd of March guidance.
Yes, we know that that schools and other education providers may also want to support other children who are vulnerable where they feel able to do so, correct?
Yep.
And eligibility for free school meals isn't sufficient.
So,
yes?
You couldn't have it too many children, okay? Go back to what it said on the 19th of March. You know, people were being asked to stay at home, stay safe, stop the spread of COVID. Okay? But we wanted to make sure that if school felt that a child was vulnerable, or if the police felt that a child was vulnerable, or a child without a social worker needed to be at school for other vulnerabilities, that the school could still offer them a place.
Yes, and we'll come back and
Yeah.
just look at how that played out in practice.
Yeah, yeah.
But obviously this guidance doesn't go into any particular detail about the categories of children who might fall into that discretionary
No, and-
area for schools, correct?
And I think it's, when we initially closed schools, and maybe this was the optimism bias that I heard Indra Morris talk about this morning, we thought it was going to be for a short period of time. So a lot of this was about safety of the child, and putting child safety first. So a child who's on with a social worker is more likely to be facing more risk than a child without a social worker. Risks other than COVID, which is why they were on the list,
Yes.
okay, from other risks. A child with an EHCP could be in a position where they would be more safe at school. They may be getting medical treatments, for example, in a special school that they couldn't be receiving at home.
Can I just
So
ask you,
that would be why the flexibility for them to be at school stayed.
can we just touch then on
Yeah.
that point and about flexibility? And sorry, go back
So
to the
if I just let me finish it. So as COVID changed and went on, the risk to the children changed as well, and the guidance evolved as well. We gave much more description about the types of children that may be in that other vulnerable category as COVID went on.
So if we could just, go back
Sorry.
to the guidance of the 22nd of March. This is INQ 000520192, please, in page 9. So this is still the 22nd of March. Thank you, it's page 9. So this was the guidance that specifically applied to children with
Yeah.
these plans. And again, I'm not going to read through all of this. I think the first bit of it sets out about the need for a risk assessment. Yes?
So if you can, section 13 is really important, page 6. This is where it says there's an expectation that vulnerable children who have a social worker will attend school.
Yes.
But for children with an EHCP, the expectation was that there would be a risk assessment, and depending on which would involve the parents in that risk assessment, and that should help to decide whether it would be safer for that children to attend school or not attend school. So there was a different level of expectation at that stage between children with a social worker and children with an EHCP.
I just want to focus on children with an EHC plan.
Okay.
So we can see that at paragraph 20, thank
Yeah.
you, on page 9. So the first part under paragraph 20 provides for the risk assessment. And then below that, it sets out we expect most children will fall into the following categories. And then we can see the first category is children and young people who would be at significant risk if their education, health and care provision and placement did not continue, namely those who could not be safely supported
Sorry.
at home.
Let me just read this. Which, yes.
And then, I don't think we need to read all of it. If we go to the second bullet point, children and young people whose needs can be met at home,
Yeah.
namely those who are not receiving personal care for their education setting. So can we just, stepping back from that and where that left children who had those plans, obviously
Yeah.
had elevated needs, the reality is what the guidance was saying is that the only children who should be coming to school are those who are receiving personal care, correct?
No, I don't think that is what it says. Because, it explicitly says, if you go back to the paragraph before this one,
Yes.
This may include those with profound and multiple learning difficulties.
Yes.
And there will be some children with profound and multiple learning difficulties who aren't receiving personal care.
Well,
Okay, it explicitly says that.
well, can I just ask you the direct question? This guidance would seem to be narrowing the category of that already quite narrow category of children with elevated needs even more, first by requiring a risk assessment and then second by giving this guidance that children and young people whose needs can be met at home, namely those who are not receiving personal care from their educational setting or whose limited need for personal care can be met in their family home.
Yes, but it says we expect most children will fall into one of those two categories.
Yes.
Children who would be at risk if their placement doesn't continue,
Yes.
because they couldn't be safely supported at home. And within that, it explicitly says this may include those with profound and multiple learning difficulties. And then, so each child, there's so many different levels of child's needs for children who are on EHCPs. This is why each child, the policy was each child should be considered individually by those who know them best. And a decision to be made, would they be safer at home or safer at school?
Yes.
Okay. And taking into account not only their health and care needs, but other needs as well. It explicitly says in the paragraph above the potential impact to the individual's well-being of changes to routine. Okay, so there may be some children who wouldn't necessarily have personal care needs, but for changes to routine could be really difficult for them.
So I think you've probably answered my question, but this guidance was really orientated towards safety. It's not.
Absolutely. And very early on in COVID, where people were terrified of COVID. We didn't really know how dangerous COVID was for children. We did have some children with some very severe needs who died early on in the pandemic, so it wasn't, some children did die. A lot of this was about safety from COVID and keeping children safe at home, isolated, low contact.
Can we just look at that then in light of...
And later on, as it became clear that there were also risks from missing out on education, risk to mental health, etc., it became more flexible on that EHCP. But also fundamentally, it was that decision, and I know a lot of communication was done on this, was meant to be co-produced with the parents and the parents' decision about whether or not the child would go into school.
All right, so if we look at the April guidance, please, that's INQ 519887, please. And I think we can just go straight to page 3 on this. And I think that continues to set out, as part of the response, educational settings have been asked to continue to provide care for a limited number of children and young people. Yes? And then it's set out here again. Mm-hmm. If we drop down a couple of paragraphs, during the coronavirus outbreak, vulnerable children and young people are defined as those. And then we have the first bracket that we're familiar with, those children who have a social
And the
worker.
sentence underneath that one.
That's what I'm just coming
Yeah.
to. Have an education health care plan whose needs cannot be met safely in the home.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the test isn't can this child safely go to school who has a plan like this. It is are they safe at home, correct?
Yeah.
So again, limiting, as it were, children with those plans. In
For
terms
their
of
safety.
well, it's saying children whose needs cannot be met safely in the home. So it's not asking the positive question, can a child with an EHC plan safely go to school? It's asking it from the reverse perspective.
Because at the time,
Yes.
the mantra across all society was stay at home, stay safe. Okay? So for most children, they are not facing the risk that a child on a child protection plan might be facing of being put at risk of physical harm in the home place. Okay? If that makes sense. Okay? So the safety for a child with a social worker was on a child protection from risk of other harms. The safety from an EHCP point of view was, do we need to have that child into school for their safety because they're receiving other treatments or because they will find the changes to their routine too traumatic, etc., or because their parents, as it said elsewhere, it said where their parents won't be able to manage to look after them without the respite that they get from school. So those were the issues.
I think this is really important so that I'm just trying to get to the nub of this.
I'm not sure why I'm not explaining.
No, I'm sure you are. I think that it's simply that
I'm really sorry.
It might be thought from reading the guidance that it was thought that children with these plans ought to be able to go to school if they were physically well enough and able to, precisely because they have elevated needs and because they have plans that set out specific provision to help them develop and stay well. But it appears from everything you've said that that was very much not the policy.
No, that was
imperative.
Where they had specific needs that could only be met in school, they were to go to school or to be able to go to school. Okay? Where those needs could safely be met at home, they would stay at home to stay safe from COVID.
Can I move on then to section 42?
And with the flexibility that schools who know their children best can overrule all of this by using the other vulnerable category as well.
I mean, we know that children with education, health and care plans attended schools in very low numbers during the first lockdown, but it sounds from everything you've said as though that's what you expected. That was the intended outcome.
That school would be there for them if they needed it.
I'm really asking you about the low numbers who attended and whether
I think
or not...
in the beginning, when our biggest concern was the risk of the child of getting COVID or not getting COVID, then yes. As we went on and schools were closed for longer, and therefore you were also concerned about the risk of them missing out on, as you said, parts of their developmental support, their education support, etc., then there was the risk became different, the risk assessment became different.
So just turning then to section 42 of the Children and Families Act, that was the statutory obligation on local authorities to meet requirements that were set out in those plans. And one of the decisions you took was to loosen that obligation, I think is a fair way of putting it, so that it became one of reasonable endeavours, correct?
So, given that schools would be closed to most children,
Yes.
and that, I mean, this is really, really difficult, and I have experience of close family members who've brought up children with serious needs and seen how incredibly challenging it is to bring up children with, and the love that goes into those children's families. I mean, it was really, really difficult. But in terms of safety, so it may have been safer for them to be at school, be at home rather than be at school. And some of those interventions that they might normally have got through their EHCP, you couldn't provide, either because they weren't at school or because the health workers in some circumstances weren't able to provide those, or they'd have been diverted elsewhere. I can talk about diversions elsewhere. They shouldn't have happened, some of those diversions of healthcare workers. I think that's really, really important. It would have put local authorities in an impossible position trying to meet things that they couldn't meet, okay? So you wanted to try and give sensible steers in these very unprecedented circumstances for how local authorities should best try and react. Okay?
I think there's a very simple point about this. We've seen the letter that you sent to the Children's Commission explaining this. And that letter sets out that one of the reasons why that change was being made was because it was very difficult to provide services to children who weren't in school. Correct?
Yes.
And I think the point is that left these children in a sort of lose-lose situation. If they could be safely kept at home, they were, but by dint of being at home, they weren't having access to the services they needed.
I mean, I really don't want to sound like an uncaring person, but there were so many lose-lose situations in COVID, okay? You know, if you'd sent your severely disabled child to school and they'd got COVID and brought it home and infected other family members, that's pretty bad as well, okay? So it had to be individual risk assessments. Really strongly believe that parents should be involved. That was very clear in the guidance, that parents should be co-produced in consultation. It was parents' decision. It says that in the guidance we set out on the risk assessments. Ultimately, it's parents' decisions whether or not they sent their children to school. Okay, and that was really clear. But schools would be closed, and most people would not be sending their children to school. Okay? If I had a severely disabled child and my neighbours, and the school was too unsafe for my neighbours' children who weren't disabled, or I had an autistic child and it was unsafe for them, but it was unsafe, you can see why parents would feel, I want to keep my child at home. Okay? However, for some children, they would be safer at school. Okay, and different special schools cope for different levels of disabilities and needs, so some of them would have more children than others. The reasonable endeavours is a term I knew from my time in business as being an onerous condition. Okay, you can't. It's a legal term. You can't just say, oh, I was acting with reasonable endeavours and then do nothing, okay? There was pressure on the local authorities. They couldn't just do nothing. They had to try and act reasonably to meet those recommendations. We passed that for 3 months and then we stopped. We were written to by the Disabled Children's Charity saying, please stop this because we think that it's too much, and we stopped it. Sorry, I'm jumping about.
My lady, I think that brings us to the point of the adjournment.
Certainly. You probably realise we take a break every so often with the stenographer, and you may welcome one as well. But I promise you, we will finish your evidence by half past 4.
Thank you.
Very well, I
Sorry
shall
if we're
turn it-
jumping about a bit.
Portia to full.
All rise.
Ms Dobbin.
Thank you. Mrs Ford, I'm going to move to the next topic, which relates to the provision of social work to children during the pandemic. And I want to begin by asking you about some of the earlier guidance, which changed, but I just want to go to it first so that we can understand how it changed. And that's at INQ 000 519 580. I think we can look at page 1 of this so that I can orientate you in time. Mrs Ford, this is dated the 3rd of April 2020. And if we go please to page 4. And we can see under supporting the workforce, if we go to the 3rd paragraph, we can see that, and if we look at the 2nd sentence, where authorities need to deviate from standard practice and statutory requirements, we expect that they'll keep clear records to capture the rationale and the risk assessment, yes? And then I think at the bottom of that page, it reiterates that message. So we accept that local authorities will struggle to meet some of their statutory duties at the moment, correct?
Yep.
And I don't think at this point in time the guidance set out which of those statutory duties, for example, they may be struggling to comply with, correct? That came a bit later.
Yeah.
All right, and if we go to page 5, please. Thank you. This relates to how social workers visit children and families, correct? And we can see that it sets out that it was expected that local authorities and social workers would make judgments that balanced, and then it sets out different risks, correct?
Yep.
It explains that social workers and their managers were best placed to make professional judgments. And then the next paragraph down, we recognise that there are circumstances where it will be necessary for social workers and other staff to visit children in person. Where face-to-face work is deemed necessary, practitioners should take account of PHE advice.
Yep.
Yes? And then if we go down a little bit further, do children's social care staff need to use PPE? It sets out where social workers and other staff are undertaking home visits, PPE is not required unless people being visited are symptomatic of coronavirus. Yes. So just a few questions arising out of this guidance. We'll come back to the issue of local authorities not being able to meet their statutory obligations, but just sticking with the question of social work visits. This guidance would appear to set up an assumption or a presumption that visits would not be face-to-face.
No.
You don't agree with that?
No, I mean, this is not great guidance. It was produced in a real rush. You know, normally guidance would be hugely consulted on, take months to produce, produced in a rush. If you go right to the very beginning of this guidance, page 1, which you haven't put up here, it really recognises that everything should be still child-centred. You know, take the view of the child first, and risk-based. Look at your riskiest cases. So you're not saying no face-to-face visits. Bear in mind, though, that the public health message that's going out is stay at home, nobody should be allowed in the home. And, you know, public health didn't want to dilute that message, okay? So, and that was a constant, you know, push-pull between us and them, okay? It probably should have said more clearly, and you know, there will be some times when you only a face-to-face visit will do, okay? If you've got a child who's at risk in a home that you suspect might be being beaten up by their parents, you know, a face-to-face visit, yes, of course you should do it. But what is clear here is that doesn't say no face-to-face
Right.
visits.
Can you remind me the date? Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
This is the 3rd of April.
3rd of
Thank
April. Anyway,
Yeah.
we can see what it says. Let's move to the Children's Commissioner's critique of that. That's at INQ 000239691.
Yeah.
So she wrote on the 6th of April, didn't she,
Yes.
setting out the concern that, and we can see that in the second paragraph, that it, as we've seen, referred to statutory duties not being met, but didn't refer to what they were, correct? That's what she's saying.
So we had already had circumstances when duties couldn't be met.
Yes.
I remember really clearly a case really early in COVID of being brought to my attention of a teenage child whose parents had both been blue lighted into hospital on the same day. And the normal process for finding a safe place for this child who's almost certainly been exposed to COVID themselves, what do you do? And the director of children's services from the local authority had taken him into his own care, this child, taken him home with him and decided to self-isolate with the child, way beyond anything. So you'd already had trying to do things outside the box. What we wanted to do was get out this message, put the child first, and if you are stretched with resources or can't do everything, go risk-based, okay? By the time the children's minister then said, this is not clear enough, commissioner then said, this is not clear enough, there needs to be more clarity. You shouldn't just say you can break every rule, where should they use more flexibility? I think we'd had a case even before the 16th of March, by the way, of a child who was in a children's home who'd been told to self-isolate because they had COVID by a GP saying, don't go and see anyone. So it's really difficult circumstances.
Yes.
So the Children's Commissioner saying, this is not clear enough, and I totally take that. I agree with that. You need to give more clarity on exact what legal flexibilities there are.
Yeah.
And we didn't, just to get it off the record, we didn't get everything right. She should have been properly consulted. There shouldn't have been an asymmetric consultation. I wasn't aware there was. As soon as I saw the first draft of changes to regulations, the first question I asked was, what did the Children's Commissioner say? So I would like to put that on the record,
Yes.
that apology, okay?
I think you're jumping ahead rather, and at the moment I'm just focusing on social work visits,
Yeah.
not the regulations.
Yeah.
But I think, I assume you could have no argument with the point that the government couldn't possibly just say to local authorities, we know you can't abide by your statutory duties, do your best.
Be child-centred and be risk-based, okay? So that's when we then moved on to very rapidly, some would say almost too rapidly, making decisions about which flexibilities to try and give some direction. And if we hadn't given some direction, then it could have been even more chaotic to local authorities, because they clearly would not have been able to stay within all the rules that they had.
I'm just going to stick
Okay.
with this letter, if I may, please. And if we look, please, so we can see at the first paragraph she sets out the concern
Yeah.
about what was said. She sets out, it's the third paragraph down, that she thought there needed to be more strategic
Yeah.
oversight. If we go over the page, please, to page 2. She's explaining that she has a dashboard. We don't need to go into that for the moment. But she sets out then her key concerns about the guidance that had been issued. So sets out, for example, in relation to social work visits,
Yep.
that saying prioritising on the basis of risk wasn't sufficient because, for example, some of these visits are statutory. Presumably some of them, the consequences or what's at stake, much higher.
So in terms of the visits, that the ones where we gave flexibility,
Yes.
Or, for example, a social worker visiting a child in a children's home.
Yes.
That if, for example, there was COVID in the children's home and the visit couldn't take place, then the visit could be done virtually delayed, but could be, not saying it had to be, but to give that flexibility.
So, Mrs. Ford, at the minute, I'm just focusing
okay.
on,
Sorry.
maybe it would help if we clarified the different kinds of visits there might
Yeah.
be. The regulations that were enacted looked after children and visits to them, didn't it? I'm talking about the adoption and coronavirus
Yes.
regulations. Separate to that, there's all of the other social work visits that social workers
Yeah.
undertake, correct? That didn't fall within the remit of those
Yeah,
regulations.
so we weren't changing those.
So I'm focusing now on the changes that were made to that latter category of social work visits. But just to lay out some of the issues that were being raised, we can see the Children's Commissioner worried about whether or not the visit statutory should be factored in, and if we follow this on through, she sets out, doesn't she, concerns about, I suppose, the practicality of some of the guidance that was being given. Yes?
She does, and she asks for more clarity, which is what was then worked towards.
Yes, so that's what I want to
There
come
were
to.
very, very intense periods of discussions that were happening from ground level up. So speaking to, for example, the Association of Directors of Children's Homes, where would they need more flexibility in the system?
Yes. So if we go to the 6th of May guidance, this was enacted, and this was after the regulations had
They went
been
hand in
enacted.
hand.
Yes. So this guidance was intended to provide guidance about the circumstances in which the regulations could be used,
Yeah.
correct? And also about how children's social work visits would be carried out, yes? So I think if we look, please, at page 1 of this, just to put it in context, I think we have the date 6th of May. Thank you. And if we can just go to perhaps page 3 of this guidance. Thank you. So this explains, I don't think we need to go through all of it, but it is just setting out, for example, and reiterating, we can see the third paragraph, that local authorities were still subject to those general duties. So reiterating that.
Yep.
Thank you. And then below that, thank you, that amendments had been made to provide for some extra flexibility.
Yep.
Yes. So, and we can see they're only used when absolutely necessary. And then below that, the amendments will remain in place for so long as is needed. So I just, again, Mrs. Ford, to be fair, this is guidance that you have, or the department has enacted in response to what the Children's Commissioner has said about the need for greater safeguards.
In response to what we were hearing from the ground as well.
Okay.
Okay. And also, in this guidance on the next page, it says there should be no blanket changes to social care.
Yes.
Okay. There should be, and I think that's really, really important. Okay.
So,
in the guidance, which went out with the regs, no blanket changes.
So
Flexibilities only where needed with senior management oversight. Kept reports could be fed into Ofsted. Ofsted could use them in their supervision of your local authorities. So, yes, we were giving flexibilities, but with safety nets and without blanket changes.
can I just add, just on the subject of the regulations, that's all I'm focusing on. This idea that there was oversight by Ofsted weren't involved in the routine gathering of the use of those regulations, were
So they had to keep records.
Yes.
And if you go back onto the page, it should be available to share with with Ofsted and may be used by Ofsted's annual engagement meetings.
Yeah,
So Ofsted are the inspector of local authorities
Yes.
for
Yes,
children's social
but I think
care.
just to be clear about it, it wasn't that Ofsted were sort of monitoring.
No, not at that stage,
Yes.
but it was, you will be the message, you will be inspected, or you could be inspected on, have you used this appropriately?
So can we
It's an
go to
important safeguard.
page 6, please, of this guidance? This is what I really want to focus on,
Yeah.
please. Those opening paragraphs of the guidance are talking about the amendment regulations. This part of the guidance is talking about the provision of social work visits in general, isn't it? So this is where we get the meat of, for example, how child protection visits would be carried out. Yes? So, as is set out underneath, there should be no blanket changes to social work practice, but coronavirus brings additional risk and complexity and may necessitate some different ways of working. We expect local authorities and social workers to make judgments about visiting which prioritises children's welfare as paramount. Yes?
Yes?
Balancing, and those are the same issues we've seen before. So having to balance risks to children, families, and to the workforce. Yes? The same language as before. Best placed to make professional judgments to decide what form of contact they need to maintain. And again, this phrase, where face-to-face work is deemed necessary, practitioners should take account of the advice on social distancing. And again, reading down, there are many ways to keep in touch with a child or young person or family without physical face-to-face contact. And it's expected that these will be utilised appropriately and proportionately in response to the risk assessment undertaken for a child on a case-by-case basis. So can I just ask you again, this is the guidance that covers the bulk of visits that social workers would make to children, isn't it? The regulations only applied to some specific statutory visits.
Yes. I assume so.
So why was the test here, or why was the general guidance where face-to-face work is deemed necessary rather than the other way round? Why is the presumption here when it comes to these visits that face-to-face work
So you'll have your
would not be in person?
statutory visits and then. So I'm not a social worker, but my understanding is that having spoken to lots of social workers and met many during this period, and if an incident has happened to a child, or they suspect an incident has happened to a child, they will have a decision about whether or not they think a face-to-face visit is necessary. And that would be normal practice to decide whether or not you need to go and see that child or not see that child.
But in the context of the pandemic, why isn't it again the reverse? Why isn't the assumption that a child would be seen in person?
So
unless that couldn't happen.
So not every call to a social worker is going to end up in a social work visit, even in normal circumstances. Okay, this is not saying you can't do visits. It's saying where you think you need to do a visit, and there should be no blanket changes to social work practice. So if you've got, I don't know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were even thinking that we might have a third of social workers off sick from time to time, and been planning up to that. Actually, sometimes it was lower. Fortunately, it was lower than that. But if you've got social workers off sick, how do you prioritise your visits? Okay, do you do somebody who's much more involved in social work practice than me, do you use your visits and your limited capacity to visit a teenager who's in a long-term stable placement with a foster carer that is probably low risk, or do you go and visit the family of the 2-year-old where you've had a call from the police that there was a domestic abuse instance the night before? Even though you didn't know that child, they've never been on your risk register before, you think they may be at risk, the police said they were really concerned about them, I suspect you go and visit the child that the police said that they were really worried about the night before, okay? And that's your deeming that a face-to-face visit is necessary rather than the statutory visit that you may have needed. And this was to give that flexibility. And the important thing, if necessary, if you had such staff sicknesses, that's what we wanted to make sure, that decisions would be risk-based, child-centred, rather, let's say you had a social worker off sick. If you're not giving any guidance, what then does the local authority do? They say, well, the social worker that's off sick, nobody's going to go and see their list this week, or we're going to look through or we're going to be risk-based and decide those were the highest risk one, and even though this social worker's off sick, we're still going to go and visit them admittedly with a different social worker. So none of this was perfect. It probably could have been clearer. Public Health England would constantly have tried to say the stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. You needed to make it clear that it was okay to make face-to-face visits where necessary.
Well, that's what I was coming to. I'm not going to take you through the various things that have been put in your, drawn to your attention in your witness pack, like the evidence from Professor Driscoll or from the serious case reviews, for example, that obviously raise issues as to the way that social work was carried out and the use, for example, of remote visits in certain circumstances. And the broad concern that has been raised that the guidance wasn't sufficiently clear.
So, can I just talk about those 4 child death reports that you asked me to comment on? I mean, they are awful, and I read every serious incident report that came through during my time as Children's Minister, and you were constantly thinking, is there something we are missing here, some group of children who could be at risk that we are not addressing? I've reread all of those serious incident case reviews, and you can't say it was the lack of social workers face-to-face visits that was the critical turning point, okay, in those cases. In the case of the death of Arthur, there was a social work visit, and the incident report review clearly says that COVID-safe working had some impact. But it also says that what the COVID-safe working that had an impact was the fact that team meetings between social workers and their managers were happening online, not face-to-face. And that was what meant that the social worker who went on that visit was not as well briefed, as it were, on what she was looking for. So the face-to-face visits, at least in the case of Arthur, of Finlay, known as Theo, of Jacob, they were still happening. There were other issues of sharing information, parents trying to hide their child, like in the case of Theo. That probably easier to hide your child from the social worker if you kept telling the social worker they had COVID because of COVID. But it wasn't lack of face-to-face. Face-to-face visits are really important, especially for really young babies. And it's really important that they use those face-to-face visits even in a pandemic. But they're not so important for some others. And that was the flexibility we were trying to give. Now, maybe the guidance could have been clearer, and maybe a good recommendation from this should be give clearer guidance that they are allowed, etc. But you have to trust the professionals to make that decision about whether or not they use them, and to still be able to use them, and to say there shouldn't be a blanket change. Use your flexibility, but use it in a risk-based way.
My lady, those are my questions. I think there are questions from core participants.
There are, Mr. Foley, who's over that way. Mrs. Ford, can you see him around the pillar?
Thank you.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Article 39, a couple of questions. In the course of the Court of Appeal hearing of the judicial review proceedings brought by Article 39 concerning the amendment regulations, the DfE conceded it was not part of the Secretary of State's case that there was insufficient time to consult the Children's Commissioner and other bodies representing children's rights. You approved the regulations without the Children's Commissioner's views. You say you did this on the proviso that you wanted to know her views, but the email to the Children's Commissioner merely advised her of the changes and did not expressly seek her views. What does this approach to the Children's Commissioner and the failure to consult with children's rights groups before approving the amendment regulations say about the DfE's approach to children's rights at the time?
So first of all, can I start by thanking Article 39? I think you do a really good job in standing up for children. They should have consulted equally. Okay, this was a time that was, as you know, unprecedented. Okay. What does it say about DfE at the time that I mean, I understand conversations were happening with her, but there weren't in writing conversations, and there probably should have been, and I apologise for that. I don't think that that was an attempt, as I say in my witness statement, to cut her out. I think it was an oversight. The first question I asked was, what's her view? And she was obviously wanted to be consulted. However, she had asked, as per that letter, for greater clarity to be given, which was what was trying to happen. I still believe that the main thing that was being done in trying to pass those regulations was trying to operate in a way that put children first and the children at greatest risk first. And yeah, another pandemic, things might be different. But in the pandemic that we were in, we were really concerned to try and make sure that things like the foster care system could hold up as well as it possibly could. So giving flexibilities to, for example, the medical approval of foster carers so you could move on and then get their medical approval later was a really sort of practical, sensible thing to do, which would keep systems working for children, make sure that you had a support system for children at a really difficult and unprecedented time. But it shouldn't, they should have consulted her.
Well, they should have consulted because...
Yes, and I've said that, and I've apologised.
There would be another side of the coin, wouldn't there? The Court of Appeal said that the consultation was entirely one-sided, excluded the most directly affected by the changes, the vulnerable children. To use your own words, your big concern was to have eyes on the vulnerable child. So, did you just lose sight of children's rights?
No.
Or were they never in your sight?
No, there was not a losing sight of the most vulnerable, okay? In terms of face-to-face visits, this was saying, if you can't organise a face-to-face visits with birth parents because the child's in a foster care placement, then that's not necessarily the most vulnerable. I mean, it'd be really difficult for the child, for some children. A really, really big issue that I know that you care about and I care about a lot is the deprivation of liberty. And it was really, how can you try and look after a child where they've got COVID, being told to self-isolate? And we were, especially in the second iteration of that, really clear that that should be only used in those very specific circumstances of self-isolation.
I think we seem to be moving
it is,
away. Forgive me.
Okay, sorry.
It's right, Mrs. Ford.
Sorry.
We're moving away. Mr. Twomey has limited time. And so if you could just focus
Yeah.
on the question, that'd be really great.
So I wouldn't say that we weren't having eyes on vulnerable children. We were really trying to keep no blanket changes, flexibility only where absolutely necessary. So, example, that deprivation of liberty, which is a big issue, only where absolutely necessary.
Removing regular visits within a fixed timescale was a blanket change, wasn't it?
No.
Let me move on to, if I may, INQ, this is an email chain, INQ 000 643 071. And this is email correspondence between someone from the DFE and the Association of Directors of Children's Services. The email at the top of the first page, timed at 11:02, beginning, my only other comment. I think it's the third sentence. We must do all we can to protect local authorities from legal action after all this is over. It will cripple local authority budgets if they're having to deal with JR, etc. Were you aware of the concerns raised in this email about the potential for legal action crippling local authority budgets post-pandemic before you approved the amendment regulations?
I really don't know. I'm really, really sorry, but that is not the reason why I approved the amendments. We approved the amendments because it was already very clear from the bottom up that some flexibilities were going to be needed, okay?
Were you aware of these concerns?
I really don't know, okay? I don't think so.
So were local authority budgetary concerns weighed in the balance against the well-being of vulnerable children?
No, the well-being of vulnerable children was always my concern, okay?
Thank you, Madam.
Absolutely.
Are you all right? It's been a long afternoon. Right.
I'm telling the truth.
Yeah. If the other advocates to my grant of permission could restrict their questions to what's absolutely necessary. It has been a long afternoon. Ms. Iqbal.
Thank you.
Ms. Iqbal's that way.
Iqbal, thank you.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mrs. Ford. I'm asking you this question on behalf of clinically vulnerable families. In section 13 of your witness statement, that's pages 74 to 81, if you want to remind yourself, you discuss, broadly, multiple charities and programmes working to support recovery of children's mental health after the peak of the pandemic, but none that specifically focus on issues faced by CVF's members. So many children in clinically vulnerable families experience severe mental health impacts from things such as bereavement if they lost a loved one, anxiety from trying to protect vulnerable family members and ensure they weren't infected, as well as the effects of social isolation, to name but a few. My question for you is this: do you agree that there should be specialist support available to these children to help them recover mentally from the trauma that they faced?
I think it must have been really difficult for children who were shielding families. But I think it was really difficult for an awful lot of children, okay? Children with an elderly grandparent who wasn't necessarily shielding. Children who lost bereaved family members, who weren't shielding. And I think, you know, we did a lot at the time to try and improve mental health support. We were rolling out mental health support teams in schools and training people as fast as you physically could to train people into those roles. We rolled them out faster during the pandemic. So I would put them as, I wouldn't like to necessarily say that every child who had a shielding parent or relative necessarily needs the same support. Okay, I would like to see more support for children and young people holistically, but I'm not sure that they would necessarily want to be categorised either. So I'm not sure. I do know that, you know, support and mental health support and bereavement support for those who lost parents at that time, struggled at that time, yes, really hard. But I think every child would have been different in what support they would have needed. And I would have hoped that a lot of that would have been support from their school.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hickman.
Thank you, my lady.
Ms. Irving.
Thank you, my lady. Mrs. Ford, I appear on behalf of disabled people's organisations. On the 29th of May 2020, almost 50 charities and organisations that work with disabled children and their families wrote to you.
Yep.
And they raised significant concerns about what we've heard described earlier as the loosening of the legal duty to secure provision for children with the HCP plans.
Yeah.
You described the reasonable endeavours duty earlier as an onerous condition. However, that letter stated that local variation was taking place in the interpretation of the reasonable endeavours duty, and that therapeutic interventions were not being provided to disabled children with potential long-term impacts for their health and well-being.
Mm-hmm.
In your evidence, you also emphasise that from the 1st of August, local authorities and health partners were again under an absolute duty to secure that provision. But despite this, as late as April 2021, a survey by Disabled Children's Partnership found that 67% of parents reported their disabled child was still not accessing all the support in their plan, with over 50% still unable to access occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, or physiotherapy. Given this, do you accept that the monitoring and accountability mechanisms in place during the pandemic were not sufficient to ensure that local authorities complied with their duties to children with education, health and care plans, whether that was to use reasonable endeavours to secure the provision for them, or from the 1st of August, the absolute duty to secure that provision? And in particular, do you accept it was not enough to rely on self-reporting by local authorities in conversation with members of your department?
So, thank you for the question. Thank you for all you do for disabled children. I fully accept that not all local authorities are meeting conditions under EHCP plans. They weren't. Okay, the SEND system was already under really extreme pressure, as you know, before COVID even started, and COVID exposed even more. And it was one of the reasons that we were doing the SEND review, which continued to be worked on even despite the pandemic. I continued to work on and push on that, and I wish more recommendations from that had been implemented by now. I'd like to say thank you for that letter, and as I recall, there were subsequent meetings on a lot of points that were raised on that letter, and that letter and the feedback from the charities that you represent is one of the reasons why those flexibilities weren't extended again, and more pressure to keep more pressure on local authorities. Well, we did have some real struggles getting therapies back for children. Okay, there was real struggles with, for example, speech and language therapists. Very difficult to do speech and language therapy in a socially distanced way with a face mask. I remember going right up to the deputy head of public health on, can we use clear masks for speech and language? I mean, remember it being really difficult for deaf children as well, that whole issue of face communications. The NHS being under huge pressures when we came out of lockdowns as well, which meant that medical provision was still being taken elsewhere. So getting those therapies back, yes, was a real struggle. It was not perfect at all. And yes, disabled families often have to fight far too much to get the support for their families, for their children. However, I do think that we tried to do as much as we could to keep children safe in the first incidence, and then to try and reopen more and more towards disabled children. And I know I championed to try and get some of those barriers lifted as much as possible, but it needs reform, the SEND system. Okay.
Thank you, Ms Irving. Mr Broach.
Thank you, my lady. Mrs Ford, I have a question for the children's rights organisations.
Yeah.
The evidence from the British Association of Social Workers this morning was that children in the care of local authorities are more vulnerable than those in parental care. The inquiry has heard that during the pandemic, there was a lack of oversight of the increased risk to children in care. Ofsted ceased all inspections from April 2020 until September 2020 of local authorities, with only assurance visits after. In that context, what work, if any, did you do to safeguard these particularly vulnerable children?
Children in care.
Yes.
So many children in care would still have been being visited. That may have been an online visit, though, I admit. Okay, and they had the ability to be at school, and if they were not going to school, then that would have been followed up. Okay, so I think that was a really important thing that maybe didn't come out this morning. If they weren't at school, it was being followed up. I know you want to finish, if I can, my lady. There's a couple of other things I'd like to put on your radar as sort of letters to my future self. The care of really very young children. We mentioned, please don't redeploy health visitors. I think more should have been done for support for families of the very young children. Later on the pandemic, double bubbles came out. That might have helped families of really very young children. The biggest thing we did to try and help stop serious incidences was that check on previously vulnerable families. A lot of these additional deaths of really young children happened with families who had been on child protection plans in the past and then had lapsed. I still don't think we understand fully the impact on really very young children of the pandemic. In your survey that you did, it was only the voices of older children. You can't, how were 6 months to 3-year-olds really impacted? And I think more thought needs to be done to that. And I spoke earlier about not leaving children for so long before a general check-in for all children, including children in care, those who hadn't been going to school. I'm sorry, I thought I'd answered your question, sir.
Well, may I just check, was the increased vulnerability of looked after children in care recognised in the pandemic in a context where Ofsted weren't inspecting local authorities for 6 months?
Yes, it was. And that was why we did as much as we can to try and keep eyes on in other ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Mr Broach. That completes the questions we have for you, Mrs Ford. I'm really grateful. I do appreciate a tough afternoon. It's just revisiting distressing periods of your working life. And obviously we approached you at a very difficult time to help us. So thank you for all that you've done to help the inquiry. And that's it.
Thank you.
Very well. I shall return for a 10 o'clock start tomorrow.
All rise.